The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip as the first rays of autumn sunlight pierced through the grey English sky. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore adjusted his red tunic one final time, the familiar weight of the ceremonial sword at his hip both comforting and melancholy. After 28 years of faithful service to the Crown, this would be his last day as a member of the Queen's Guard. Thomas stood at his usual post outside the castle's main entrance, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in the regulation stance that had become as natural as breathing. The tourists hadn't arrived yet, and the morning air carried the crisp promise of winter. At 53, he felt every year in his joints, every decade in the ache of his lower back from standing at attention for countless hours. But, today, that familiar discomfort was overshadowed by a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. He had joined the Guards straight out of military college, young and eager to serve. The pomp and ceremony had seemed glamorous then, the red uniform a symbol of honor and tradition. Now, as he watched the castle groundskeepers going about their morning routines, he wondered what civilian life would hold for him. His wife Margaret had already planned their retirement, a small cottage in the Cotswolds, a garden to tend, and grandchildren to spoil. The thought brought a rare smile to his usually stoic features. "Morning, Sergeant Whitmore." The voice belonged to Corporal Davies, a young man barely out of his 20s who reminded Thomas of himself 3 decades ago. "Last day, then?" "Indeed it is, Davies." Thomas kept his eyes forward, as protocol demanded, but his voice carried warmth. "Make sure you keep the lads in line when I'm gone. Won't be the same without you, sir. The new recruits look up to you." Thomas had trained dozens of young guards over the years, watching them transform from nervous boys into proud protectors of the realm. Some had moved on to other positions, others had made the Guards their career as he had. A few hadn't made it through the rigorous training and demanding lifestyle. But each one had taught him something about leadership, about patience, and about the weight of tradition they all carried. The castle began to stir with more activity as the morning progressed. Kitchen staff hurried through service corridors, their arms laden with supplies for the day's meals. Housekeepers wheeled carts of fresh linens through doorways that had witnessed centuries of royal history. The administrative staff arrived in their sensible cars, briefcases in hand, ready to manage the complex machinery of modern monarchy. Thomas had seen it all before, countless times, but today he found himself noticing details that usually escaped his attention. The way the morning light caught the carved stone gargoyles on the castle's towers. The sound of his fellow guards' boots on the ancient cobblestones during the changing of the guard ceremony. The respectful nods from staff members who had worked alongside him for years. Around mid-morning, a familiar black car pulled up to the main entrance. Thomas recognized it immediately, Princess Anne's official vehicle. The Princess Royal was known for her no-nonsense attitude and tireless work ethic. Unlike some members of the royal family, she rarely kept people waiting and expected the same efficiency from others. As the car came to a stop, Thomas stepped forward to perform his final official duty. The driver, a middle-aged man Thomas had seen many times before, emerged and walked around to open the passenger door. Thomas maintained his position, ready to provide escort if needed, though Princess Anne was perfectly capable of managing on her own. The princess stepped out of the vehicle with her characteristic brisk efficiency. She wore a navy blue coat and carried a leather briefcase, every inch the working royal she was known to be. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her expression carried the focus of someone with a packed schedule ahead. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, offering the regulation salute. Princess Anne paused and turned toward him, a slight frown creasing her brow. "Sergeant Whitmore, isn't it? I heard this was your final day." "Yes, ma'am. Retiring after 28 years of service." 28 years, she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "You've been a constant presence here. The castle won't be quite the same without you." Thomas felt a surge of pride at the recognition. It wasn't often that members of the royal family took notice of individual guards, though Princess Anne was known for her attention to detail and genuine appreciation for those who served the crown. "Thank you, ma'am. It's been an honor." As the princess began to move toward the castle entrance, her driver fell into step behind her. Thomas glanced at the man, average height, dark hair starting to gray at the temples, wearing the standard chauffeur's uniform. Something about him seemed familiar, though Thomas couldn't quite place where he might have seen him before. The feeling nagged at him as he returned to his post. In his line of work, he had developed an acute memory for faces. It was part of the job, being able to recognize authorized personnel, regular visitors, and potential threats. But this particular face stirred something deeper than professional recognition. There was something unsettling about it, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The morning continued with its usual rhythm. Tour groups began arriving, their guides leading them through the public areas of the castle while explaining centuries of history. Thomas answered the occasional question from curious visitors, though most were content to simply take photographs of the guards in their iconic red uniforms. During his lunch break, Thomas found himself in the guards' common room, sharing stories with younger colleagues who had gathered to wish him well. They spoke of memorable incidents: the time a tourist had fainted during a particularly hot summer ceremony, the visiting dignitary who had tried to tip a guard, the endless rain during the Queen's Jubilee celebrations. "Remember when that photographer tried to sneak into the private quarters?" Corporal Matthews asked, laughing. Sergeant Whitmore spotted him from 50 yards away. "Experience," Thomas replied simply. "You learn to notice what doesn't belong." As he said it, his mind returned to Princess Anne's driver. What was it about the man that seemed out of place? Thomas had seen him many times over the past few months, always professional, always appropriately dressed and behaved. But something was bothering him, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to surface. The afternoon brought a steady stream of official visitors. Thomas watched them come and go: government ministers, foreign diplomats, charity representatives. Each arrival followed the same protocol: identification checked, escort provided, departure logged. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a dance of security and courtesy that had been perfected over generations. Around 3 o'clock, Princess Anne emerged from the castle for her departure. She moved with the same purposeful stride, her day's work completed with characteristic efficiency. Her driver was waiting by the car, door already open, engine running in preparation for whatever appointment awaited next. As the princess approached the vehicle, she paused and looked back at Thomas. "Sergeant, might I have a word?" Thomas stepped forward, curious about this unusual request. Princess Anne was not given to casual conversation with the guards, though she was always polite and respectful. "I wanted to thank you personally for your years of service," she said. "Loyalty like yours is increasingly rare, and it hasn't gone unnoticed." "Thank you, ma'am. That means a great deal. I hope retirement treats you well." "You've earned it." She turned to enter the car, but, as she did, her driver looked directly at Thomas for the first time. Their eyes met for just a moment, but it was enough. The man's expression was neutral, professional, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or calculation. And, in that instant, Thomas remembered where he had seen that face before. It had been 15 years ago, maybe longer. Thomas had been part of a security detail for Princess Anne during a visit to a rehabilitation center for young offenders. The princess was patron of several such organizations, and these visits were routine parts of her official duties. But this particular visit had ended abruptly when one of the residents had become aggressive, making threats that the security team had taken seriously. The young man had been removed from the program shortly after, but not before Thomas had gotten a good look at his face. The same dark hair, the same sharp features, the same intense eyes that seemed to catalog everything around them. He had been perhaps 20 then, angry and defiant in the way that troubled young men often were. But that had been 15 years ago. The man driving Princess Anne's car was older now, his hair graying, his manner polished and professional. Could it really be the same person? Thomas found himself doubting his own memory. Surely the security clearance required for someone in such a position would have uncovered any criminal history or connection to past incidents. Yet the resemblance was striking. And something about the man's demeanor when their eyes had met suggested that he, too, had recognized Thomas. As the car pulled away from the castle, Thomas stood frozen in place, his mind racing. Protocol demanded that he report any security concerns immediately. But what exactly would he report? That a driver bore a resemblance to someone from 15 years ago? That he had felt uneasy about a look that had lasted less than a second? The rational part of his mind insisted he was being paranoid. After nearly 3 decades of security work, it wasn't unusual for faces to blur together or for memory to play tricks. The stress of his final day, the emotions of leaving a career behind, these factors could easily explain why he was seeing threats where none existed. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive and successful in this job for 28 years, insisted that his instincts were correct. Something was wrong, even if he couldn't yet articulate what it was. The remainder of the afternoon passed slowly, each minute waited with indecision. Thomas performed his duties mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Should he make a report? To whom? And what would he say that wouldn't sound like the paranoid ramblings of an aging guard on his last day? As evening approached, Thomas found himself no closer to a decision. The castle began its transition to night mode, fewer staff, dimmed lights in the public areas, the quiet efficiency of evening security protocols taking effect. His replacement had already arrived, a young sergeant eager to prove himself worthy of the position. Everything quiet today? Sergeant Morrison asked as they prepared for the formal handover. Yes, Thomas replied, then hesitated. Morrison, how well do you know Princess Anne's regular driver? The dark-haired fellow? Been here about 6 months, I'd say. Seems professional enough. Why do you ask? Just wondering. You know how it is, like to keep track of the regular faces. Morrison nodded, understanding the unspoken importance of knowing who belonged and who didn't. It was perhaps the most crucial skill a royal guard could develop. As the official ceremony marking the end of Thomas's service concluded, his colleagues gathered around to offer their final congratulations and well wishes. There were handshakes, a few emotional moments, and promises to stay in touch that they all knew would be difficult to keep given the demanding nature of their work. Thomas changed out of his red uniform for the last time, hanging it carefully in his locker. The civilian clothes felt strange after so many years in military dress, but they also felt like freedom. He packed his personal items into a small box, photographs, commendations, a few mementos from his years of service. But, as he prepared to leave the castle grounds for the final time as an employee, the nagging concern about Princess Anne's driver refused to leave him alone. Standing in the guard's parking area, looking back at the ancient walls that had been his workplace for so long, Thomas made a decision. He would make some discreet inquiries. Not an official report, not yet, but some careful investigation on his own. He had contacts throughout the security services, people who owed him favors or who respected his judgment enough to help without asking too many questions. If his suspicions proved unfounded, no harm would be done. But if there was indeed something to worry about, if the man he had seen really was the same angry young offender from 15 years ago, then someone needed to know. Thomas climbed into his own car, a modest sedan that seemed almost shabby compared to the official vehicles he was used to seeing. As he drove through the castle gates for what he assumed would be the last time, he was already planning his next moves. The irony wasn't lost on him. His first day of retirement would be spent investigating what might be his last case as a protector of the crown. But some habits, he reflected, were too ingrained to abandon overnight. The evening air was crisp as he drove toward home, where Margaret would be waiting with dinner and questions about his final day. He would tell her about the ceremony, about the well wishes from his colleagues, about Princess Anne's kind words. But he wouldn't mention his suspicions about the driver. Not yet. Some concerns were too serious to voice until you were certain they had merit. And Thomas Whitmore, despite his retirement, was not yet ready to stop being certain about the safety of those he had sworn to protect. Thomas Whitmore woke before dawn, a habit so deeply ingrained that even retirement couldn't break it. The cottage was quiet, Margaret still sleeping peacefully beside him. For the first time in 28 years, he had nowhere specific to be, no uniform to don, no post to maintain. The freedom should have felt liberating, but instead it left him restless and uncertain. He made coffee in the small kitchen, standing by the window that overlooked their modest garden. The roses Margaret had planted were beginning their autumn decline, their petals scattered across the lawn like confetti from a celebration that had ended. The normalcy of the scene, the suburban quiet, the neighbor's cat picking its way across the fence, felt almost surreal after decades of castle walls and ceremonial duties. But his mind wasn't on retirement or gardens. Throughout the night, the face of Princess Anne's driver had haunted his sleep. Thomas had always prided himself on his memory for faces and details. It was what had made him good at his job, what had kept the royal family safe during his watch. And that memory kept insisting that the polished, professional chauffeur was the same young man who had been escorted from a rehabilitation center 15 years ago. The incident had occurred during one of Princess Anne's routine visits to support programs for troubled youth. The princess took such engagements seriously, believing in the power of redemption and second chances. She had been speaking with a group of residents when one young man, Thomas remembered his name now, Michael Sterling, had become increasingly agitated. Sterling had been perhaps 20 then, with the kind of restless energy that spoke of deeper problems. He had interrupted the princess's conversation, his voice rising as he made accusations about the system, about how people like her couldn't understand what people like him went through. The situation had escalated quickly, and Thomas had been the one to step forward when Sterling's gestures became threatening. "You think you're better than us," Sterling had shouted, his eyes blazing with resentment. "All of you, with your fancy clothes and your fake concern. But I see through it. I see through all of you." The words themselves weren't particularly threatening, but the intensity behind them had set off every alarm in Thomas's experienced mind. There had been something calculating in Sterling's anger, something that suggested his outburst was more than just youthful rebellion. When Thomas had moved to intervene, Sterling had fixed him with a stare that held genuine malice. "I won't forget this," Sterling had said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that had made Thomas's blood run cold. "Any of this." The young man had been removed from the program that very day. Thomas had made sure to include a detailed report in the security files, recommending that Sterling be flagged for future reference. But 15 years was a long time, and Thomas had assumed the young man had either found his way to a better path or deeper into whatever darkness had been consuming him. Now, sitting in his kitchen with morning light slowly filling the room, Thomas was forced to confront the possibility that Michael Sterling had indeed found a path, one that led directly into the heart of royal security. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Margaret's voice called sleepily from upstairs, asking if he would answer it. Thomas picked up the receiver, expecting a neighbor or perhaps one of his former colleagues calling to check on his first day of retirement. "Thomas? It's David Chen." Thomas straightened, recognizing the voice of his former contact in the Metropolitan Police's protection unit. Chen had worked alongside the Royal Guards on numerous occasions, and the two men had developed a mutual respect over the years. "David. Early morning for a phone call. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I heard you retired yesterday. Congratulations, by the way." "Thank you. But I suspect this isn't a social call." Chen's pause confirmed Thomas's suspicion. "Actually, no. I have a favor to ask. Completely unofficial, you understand. But there's been some chatter in intelligence circles about potential security concerns around the royal family. Nothing specific, nothing actionable, but enough to make people nervous." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of chatter?" "The usual conspiracy theories, mostly. Online forums discussing vulnerabilities, people making vague threats they probably don't mean. But there's been an uptick in activity recently, and my superiors are asking those of us with royal protection experience to keep our ears open." "I'm retired, David. As of yesterday." "I know. But you also have better instincts than anyone I've worked with. If you notice anything unusual, anything that doesn't feel right, I'd appreciate a call." Thomas stared out at the garden, where Margaret's roses continued their slow surrender to autumn. "David, hypothetically speaking, if someone had concerns about the background check process for royal household staff, where would they take those concerns?" The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. When Chen spoke again, his voice was more alert. "Hypothetically? They would take them very seriously indeed." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about protocols. After all these years, I still learn something new." Thomas, if you have specific concerns, please don't keep them to yourself. The security of the royal family isn't something to gamble with. After ending the call, Thomas sat in the growing daylight and weighed his options. Chen's call had been suspiciously well-timed, arriving just as Thomas was grappling with his own concerns. It could be coincidence, but Thomas had learned not to believe in coincidence when it came to security matters. He needed more information before making any official reports. Accusations without evidence would damage his reputation and credibility. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that a potential threat was already inside the security perimeter. Margaret came downstairs an hour later, dressed for her morning walk. She found Thomas still sitting at the kitchen table, his coffee long cold, staring out at nothing. "You're brooding," she said, kissing the top of his head. "I thought retirement was supposed to cure you of that." "Just adjusting to the change," he replied, managing a smile. "It's strange not having anywhere to be." "Well, you'll find plenty to do. Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned that their fence needs repairing, and you promised to help with the church jumble sale next month." The mundane concerns of civilian life felt simultaneously appealing and alien. Thomas nodded and made appropriate responses, but his mind remained elsewhere. After Margaret left for her walk, he went to his small home office and opened the filing cabinet where he kept personal papers. Buried among insurance documents and tax records, he found what he was looking for, a small notebook where he had kept track of security incidents over the years. It was an unofficial record, his own way of cataloging events that might not have made it into official reports but seemed worth remembering. He flipped through pages of careful handwriting, noting dates and brief descriptions. Car registrations of vehicles that had lingered too long outside the castle. Names of individuals who had made inappropriate comments during tours. Patterns of behavior that had caught his attention without necessarily warranting formal action. There, on a page dated 15 years ago, he found the entry about Michael Sterling. Thomas had recorded not just the basic facts of the incident, but also his own impressions of the young man. Intelligent, he had written. Calculating behind the anger. Potential for escalation. Recommend ongoing monitoring. Below that, in different ink, was an addition Thomas had made several months later, Sterling released from program. Whereabouts unknown. Case closed pending future contact. Thomas stared at the page, remembering how the incident had bothered him for weeks afterward. Sterling hadn't been like the typical troubled youth they encountered. There had been something more purposeful about his behavior, something that suggested his anger was being channeled rather than simply expressed. He closed the notebook and returned to the kitchen, where he found Margaret back from her walk and preparing lunch. "Feeling any better?" she asked, studying his face with the intuition of 30 years of marriage. "I think I need to take a drive," he said. "Visit some old friends, get closure on the job." Margaret nodded, understanding without needing details. She had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about Thomas's work, trusting his judgment about what she needed to know. Thomas drove into London, taking familiar routes that led him to the Metropolitan Police headquarters. David Chen was expecting him, though Thomas had been careful not to explain the full reason for his visit over the phone. They met in Chen's office, a cluttered space filled with case files and photographs. Chen was a compact man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that spoke of years in protection work. "You sounded concerned on the phone," Chen said, closing the office door. "What's troubling you?" Thomas told him about the driver, about the resemblance to Michael Sterling, about the incident 15 years ago. He was careful to present it as a concern rather than an accusation, emphasizing that he could be wrong about the identification. Chen listened without interruption, taking notes in a small pad. When Thomas finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Michael Sterling," Chen repeated. "The name doesn't ring a bell, but 15 years is a long time. Let me run some searches, see what comes up in the databases. I don't want to ruin someone's career over a case of mistaken identity. And I don't want to ignore a legitimate security concern. Give me a day or two to check records. If this Sterling fellow has been living a clean life for 15 years, there should be evidence of that. If not..." Chen didn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood the implications. They both knew that people with genuine grudges against the royal family were patient, often willing to spend years building legitimate covers for their true intentions. That evening, Thomas found himself restless again. He tried to watch television with Margaret, attempted to read the newspaper, even considered starting the gardening project she had been suggesting for months. But his mind kept returning to the morning at the castle, to the moment when his eyes had met those of Princess Anne's driver. The next day brought a call from Chen earlier than expected. "We need to meet," Chen said without preamble. "Not at the office. Somewhere private." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Kensington, far enough from both the police headquarters and the castle to avoid unwanted attention. Thomas arrived first, choosing a corner table where he could watch the door and surrounding area, habits that retirement hadn't yet broken. Chen arrived looking troubled, carrying a thin folder that he placed carefully on the table between them. "You were right to be concerned," Chen said quietly. "Michael Sterling has indeed been living under an assumed identity for the past 6 years. His real name is Michael Peterson now, complete with a fabricated employment history and background." Thomas felt his blood chill. How fabricated? Professional level. The kind of false identity that costs serious money and requires connections in very dark places. He's been building this persona carefully, methodically. And, for the past 6 months, he's been working as a driver for the royal household. How did he pass the security clearance? Chen's expression was grim. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Either there's been a massive failure in the vetting process, or someone helped him from the inside." The implications of that statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Sterling had help from within the security services, it meant the threat was far more serious than a single disturbed individual seeking revenge. It suggested organization, planning, and resources that could compromise the entire royal protection system. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. "Now we move very carefully. If Sterling suspects we're onto him, he might accelerate whatever timeline he's working with. And if there are others involved, we need to identify them before we act." Chen opened the folder and showed Thomas several photographs. They were surveillance shots, grainy but clear enough to show Princess Anne's driver in various locations around London. In some, he appeared to be alone, but, in others, he was with individuals that Thomas didn't recognize. "We've been watching him for the past 18 hours, Chen explained. He maintains his cover well, but he's been having meetings with people who don't appear in any of his official records." Thomas studied the photographs, his trained eye noting details that might escape casual observation. Sterling, or Peterson, as he was now known, appeared relaxed and confident in the images, nothing in his body language suggesting paranoia or concern about surveillance. "He's good," Thomas admitted. 15 years ago, he was angry and impulsive. This suggests significant training or guidance. Or both. "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer." Chen's tone made Thomas look up from the photographs. "In all your years of service, did you ever have reason to suspect that someone within the royal protection system might be compromised? Anyone who seemed to have access to information they shouldn't, or who asked questions that seemed inappropriate?" Thomas considered the question seriously. Over nearly 3 decades, he had worked with hundreds of colleagues, seen personnel come and go, witnessed changes in procedures and protocols. The royal protection system was necessarily secretive, but it was also necessarily collaborative. "No," he said finally. "I never had reason to suspect anyone specific. But that doesn't mean much. If someone was truly skilled at maintaining a false identity, they might never give themselves away to someone at my level." Chen nodded, as if expecting that answer. "We're going to need your help with this, Thomas. I know you're retired, but you have knowledge and instincts that we can't replace." "What kind of help?" "Sterling knows you recognize him. That makes you a potential target, but it also makes you valuable bait. He might make contact, try to determine how much you know or remember." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the London weather. "You want me to wait for a man who threatened the royal family to approach me?"
We want to give him the opportunity to make a mistake.
But we'll be watching, Thomas.
You won't be alone in this.
As Thomas drove home that evening, his mind raced with the implications of what Chen had told him. His quiet retirement had vanished, replaced by the kind of high-stakes security work he had thought he was leaving behind. But Princess Anne was still in danger, and he was possibly the only person who could identify the threat in time to stop it. Margaret was in the garden when he arrived home, tending to her roses despite their declining state. She looked up as he approached, and Thomas saw in her eyes that she knew something significant had changed. "The job isn't quite finished yet, is it?" she asked quietly. "I'm afraid not," Thomas replied.
"But it will be soon. One way or another."
That night, as Margaret slept beside him, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in London, a man with a 15-year-old grudge was planning something that could endanger the royal family. And Thomas, despite his retirement, was once again the thin line standing between threat and target. But this time, the stakes felt higher than they ever had before. Because this time, the enemy was already inside the gates. The surveillance began the next morning, though Thomas was instructed to maintain his normal routine as much as possible. David Chen's team had established observation points around Thomas's neighborhood, with rotating shifts to avoid detection. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution: wait for Michael Sterling to make contact, then follow him back to whoever else might be involved in the plot.
Thomas found the waiting almost unbearable.
After decades of active duty, being relegated to the role of potential victim went against every instinct he had developed. But Chen had been insistent. Sterling was too well trained and too careful to be taken down through conventional surveillance alone.
They needed him to feel secure enough to expose his network.
Margaret sensed the tension immediately, though Thomas had told her only that he was consulting on a security matter. She didn't press for details, but he caught her watching him with the worried expression he remembered from his early days in the service, when the dangers had been more obvious and the stakes more clearly defined. "You're carrying that old weight again," she said over breakfast on the third day of surveillance. "The one you used to get when something at work was particularly serious." Thomas looked up from his untouched eggs, meeting his wife's concerned gaze. "It's just a consultation, Margaret.
Helping them with some background research." "Research that has unmarked cars parked on our street at all hours?" She raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, I've been married to you for 30 years. I know when you're in the middle of something significant." Before he could respond, the phone rang. Thomas answered it on the second ring, noting the unfamiliar number on the caller ID. "Thomas Whitmore speaking." "Sergeant Whitmore."
The voice was calm, polite, with just a hint of an accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. "I believe we know each other, though it's been many years."
Thomas's blood went cold.
He gestured frantically to Margaret, who understood immediately and quietly left the room to give him privacy. Chen had briefed him on this possibility, but the reality of hearing Sterling's voice was still jarring.
"I'm sorry, I don't recognize your voice." "Who is this?" "Michael Peterson. I work for Princess Anne's household."
"We've seen each other many times, though we've never been formally introduced." The use of his assumed name was deliberate, Thomas realized. Sterling was testing him, seeing if he would acknowledge the true identity or play along with the deception.
"Ah yes, of course. The princess's driver. How can I help you, Mr. Peterson? I was wondering if we might meet for coffee."
"There are some matters related to royal security that I'd like to discuss with someone of your experience and reputation." The request was perfectly reasonable on its surface, exactly the kind of consultation a new member of the royal household might seek from a respected veteran. But Thomas could hear something else in the tone, a careful precision that spoke of rehearsed lines and calculated moves. "I'm retired now, Mr. Peterson.
I'm not sure how much help I could be." "Oh, I think you might be surprised.
There are some historical precedents I'd like to discuss, some patterns that someone with your memory might help me understand." The word memory was emphasized slightly, and Thomas understood the implicit threat. Sterling was letting him know that he remembered their previous encounter just as clearly as Thomas did.
"Very well. Where did you have in mind?"
There's a small cafe in Richmond, near the park. The Riverside Terrace.
Do you know it?
Thomas did know it, a quiet establishment popular with retirees and dog walkers, the kind of place where two men could have a conversation without attracting attention.
I can be there in an hour. Excellent.
I look forward to our chat, Sergeant.
There's so much history to discuss.
After hanging up, Thomas immediately called Chen's number. The phone was answered before the first ring finished. He made contact, Thomas said without preamble. Wants to meet at the Riverside Terrace in Richmond in 1 hour. We'll have the place covered before you arrive.
Thomas, remember, he's testing you.
Don't give away how much you remember or suspect.
Let him do the talking. And, if he tries something? He won't. Not in a public place, not during a first contact.
But, if something goes wrong, the code word is Margaret.
Say it in any context, and we'll move in immediately. The drive to Richmond took Thomas through parts of London he hadn't visited in years.
The familiar streets brought back memories of his younger days on the force, when the world had seemed more straightforward and the lines between right and wrong more clearly drawn. Now, heading into what could be a trap, Thomas found himself reflecting on how much more complicated everything had become. The Riverside Terrace was exactly as he remembered, a small, wood-paneled cafe with windows overlooking the Thames. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where he could observe the entrance while appearing to watch the river traffic. He ordered tea and settled in to wait, his eyes scanning the other patrons for any signs of surveillance or threat. Chen's team would be positioned around the cafe, but Thomas knew they would be invisible to casual observation. The skill required to maintain covert surveillance in broad daylight was considerable, and Thomas found himself hoping that Sterling's training wasn't sophisticated enough to detect their presence. Michael Sterling arrived precisely on time, and Thomas was struck again by how much the angry young man had changed. He moved with quiet confidence, his appearance professional and unremarkable. Anyone watching would see simply a middle-aged man in a well-tailored suit, the kind of person who belonged in the circles of power he now moved within.
Sergeant Whitmore, Sterling said, extending his hand as he approached the table. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thomas shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze.
Up close, there was no question about the identification. This was definitely the same person who had been removed from the rehabilitation center 15 years ago.
Please, call me Thomas. I'm retired now, after all. Sterling smiled as he took the seat across from Thomas, signaling the waitress for coffee. Retirement. How are you finding it?
Quieter than I expected. Though I suspect that's about to change. Perhaps.
Tell me, Thomas, in all your years of service, did you ever encounter situations where someone's past came back to influence their present circumstances?
The question was carefully phrased, but its meaning was clear enough. Sterling was acknowledging their shared history while maintaining the pretense of a professional consultation.
Occasionally.
The past has a way of following people, especially in security work.
Details that seemed unimportant at the time can become significant later.
Yes, exactly.
Sterling's eyes lit up with apparent enthusiasm. I've been researching some historical incidents, trying to understand patterns of behavior that might be relevant to current security protocols.
He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thin folder, placing it on the table between them.
For instance, I found references to an incident at a youth rehabilitation center some years ago.
A minor disruption during a royal visit, but one that highlighted some interesting vulnerabilities in protection procedures.
Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened.
Sterling was being more direct than expected, essentially confirming Thomas's identification while maintaining his cover story.
I'm afraid I don't recall the specific incident you're referring to.
Really?
I was told you were present at the time. In fact, some reports suggest you were instrumental in resolving the situation. The game was becoming clearer now.
Sterling wasn't just testing Thomas's memory, he was probing to see how much the security services remembered about him, how detailed their records were, and whether his current false identity was holding up under scrutiny.
As I said, I'm retired. A lot of incidents blur together over nearly 3 decades of service. Sterling nodded, as if accepting this explanation. But Thomas caught a flicker of something: disappointment? Frustration? In his eyes. Of course. Though I imagine some faces stick with you more than others.
Particularly those associated with unusual circumstances. Mr. Peterson, Thomas said carefully, if you have specific security concerns about current protocols, perhaps you should discuss them with active personnel rather than a retired guard.
But, you see, Thomas, some concerns are best discussed with people who have the appropriate historical perspective. People who understand how past mistakes can inform present precautions. Sterling leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. For instance, what would you do if you discovered that someone with a questionable background had somehow gained access to sensitive positions within the royal household? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Thomas found deeply unsettling. Was Sterling testing him, or was he actually revealing something about the extent of the conspiracy Chen had suspected?
I would report it through proper channels immediately.
Would you? Even if those proper channels might themselves be compromised?
Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside.
What are you suggesting?
Sterling smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm suggesting that sometimes the threats to security come from within the system itself. That sometimes the people responsible for protection are the very ones who pose the greatest danger. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious world, Thomas.
More serious than most people realize.
Sterling closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase, the gesture somehow final.
I want to thank you for your time. This conversation has been very informative. I'm not sure I've told you anything particularly useful.
On the contrary.
You've told me exactly what I needed to know.
As Sterling stood to leave, he paused and looked down at Thomas with an expression that was almost pitying.
Enjoy your retirement, Sergeant. Try not to worry too much about things that are no longer your responsibility. Thomas watched him leave, noting the casual confidence in his stride.
Sterling showed no signs of concern about surveillance or pursuit. Either he was supremely confident in his abilities, or he knew something about the surveillance that Thomas didn't. After waiting 5 minutes, Thomas left the cafe and walked slowly toward his car, following Chen's instructions to maintain normal behavior. But his mind was racing with the implications of what Sterling had revealed. The suggestion that the royal protection system itself might be compromised was staggering. It would mean that Sterling's network had penetrated far deeper than anyone suspected, that people in positions of significant trust were actively working to undermine the security they were supposed to provide. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message as he reached his car. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was clear enough: some conversations are more productive when held in private.
Tomorrow evening, 8 p.m., Kew Gardens main entrance. Come alone if you want answers.
Thomas stared at the message for several seconds before deleting it.
Sterling was escalating, moving from subtle probing to direct contact.
The suggestion of a meeting in Kew Gardens, a large, complex location with multiple entrance and exit points, showed tactical thinking that went well beyond simple criminal planning.
He drove home in thoughtful silence, considering his options.
Chen would want to know about the message immediately, but Thomas found himself hesitating. Sterling's hints about compromise within the security services were troubling enough to make him question who could be trusted with sensitive information. Margaret was waiting in the garden when he arrived, pruning the last of the season's roses. She looked up as he approached, her expression concerned.
How did your consultation go?
Complicated, Thomas replied honestly.
More complicated than I expected.
That evening, as Thomas sat in his study reviewing the day's events, he found himself torn between protocol and instinct. Every procedure he had learned over 3 decades insisted that he should report Sterling's message immediately and let Chen's team handle the surveillance and approach. But Sterling's warnings about internal compromise nagged at him.
What if reporting the message put Sterling on guard? What if someone within Chen's team was feeding information back to Sterling's network? The phone rang, interrupting his brooding.
It was Chen, his voice tense with urgency.
Thomas, we lost him. Sterling disappeared about 2 hours after your meeting. Professional level evasion, he knew exactly what he was doing. He left me a message, Thomas said after a moment's hesitation. He wants another meeting tomorrow night. Where? Thomas told him about Kew Gardens, watching through his window as Margaret continued her patient work among the roses. It's a trap, Chen said immediately. He's moving too fast, getting too direct. We need to bring him in now, before he does whatever he's planning. And if he really does have people inside the security services? If this is exactly what he wants us to do? The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. When Chen spoke again, his voice carried a new note of uncertainty. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we need to play this his way, at least initially. Let him think he's in control, see what he reveals. That's too dangerous, Thomas. If something goes wrong. If something goes wrong with the direct approach, we might never find out who else is involved. Sterling isn't working alone, your own surveillance proved that. We need to know how deep this goes. After ending the call, Thomas sat in his study for a long time, staring at photographs from his years of service. Pictures of ceremonial events, official visits, the routine pageantry that had defined his working life. In every image, there were faces in the background, security personnel, household staff, officials whose job it was to protect and serve. How many of those faces, he wondered, might belong to people like Sterling? How many seemingly loyal servants might harbor darker intentions? The next 24 hours would determine whether his suspicions were justified or whether he was walking into a carefully laid trap. Either way, Thomas knew that his quiet retirement was officially over. Some duties, he reflected, were too important to abandon, even when common sense suggested otherwise. Thomas spent the day of the meeting in careful preparation, though he had to balance readiness with the appearance of normalcy. Margaret noticed his increased tension but didn't comment directly, instead finding small ways to show her support. His favorite breakfast, freshly pressed clothes laid out on the bed, a longer than usual kiss goodbye when he left for what she understood might be a dangerous evening. David Chen's team had established a perimeter around Kew Gardens hours before the scheduled meeting, but Thomas insisted on entering alone as Sterling had requested. The compromise was a concealed communication device and GPS tracker, along with predetermined signals that would bring backup within minutes if needed. The gardens at dusk were hauntingly beautiful, the autumn foliage creating a palette of gold and crimson that glowed in the fading light. Thomas walked slowly along the main path from the entrance, noting the handful of other visitors, dog walkers taking advantage of the cooler evening air, couples strolling hand in hand, the occasional jogger following the established routes. Any of them could be part of Sterling's network, Thomas realized. The thought that he might be walking into an ambush orchestrated by multiple conspirators was sobering, but not entirely surprising. Nothing about this situation had been simple from the beginning. Sterling appeared exactly at 8 o'clock, emerging from a side path with the casual confidence that had characterized all their interactions. He wore dark clothing that would blend into the evening shadows, and Thomas noted that he kept his hands visible and moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in potentially dangerous situations. Thomas, Sterling said, approaching with a slight smile. Thank you for coming. I wasn't entirely certain you would. Your message suggested this conversation might provide answers to some important questions. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Direct as always. I appreciate that quality in a man. Sterling gestured toward a nearby bench positioned under an ancient oak tree, somewhat isolated from the main walking paths. As they settled themselves, Thomas was acutely aware of the tactical disadvantages of his position: limited sightlines, multiple approach routes for potential attackers, and enough ambient noise from the gardens to muffle conversation. Before we begin, Sterling said, I want you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is true, regardless of how incredible it might sound. I'm listening. Sterling was quiet for a moment, studying Thomas's face in the gathering darkness. 15 years ago, you witnessed something at that rehabilitation center. Not just my outburst, but something else. Something that's been eating at you ever since. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though Sterling's words triggered a memory he had tried to suppress. There had been something else that day,
something beyond the young man's angry confrontation with Princess Anne. During the evacuation, Sterling continued, you saw one of the security escorts speaking quietly with someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who had no official reason to be at that facility. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. In the confusion following Sterling's removal, Thomas had noticed a man in an expensive suit speaking intently with one of the escort officers near the facility's rear exit. The conversation had lasted less than a minute, but something about the body language, the urgency, the secrecy, had struck Thomas as odd. I remember, Thomas admitted. But I never identified who the man was. His name was Richard Hartwell. A senior advisor to the Home Secretary at the time. The same Richard Hartwell who, 5 years later, was promoted to oversee royal protection protocols. Thomas felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. You're suggesting that my removal from that program wasn't random administrative action. I'm not suggesting it, Thomas. I'm telling you it was carefully orchestrated. Hartwell had been monitoring that facility, looking for individuals with specific psychological profiles and particular grievances against the establishment. Sterling reached into his jacket and withdrew a small tablet device, its screen glowing softly in the darkness. He was recruiting Thomas. Building a network of people with legitimate reasons to hate the system, then training them and placing them in positions where they could do the most damage. The tablet displayed what appeared to be official documents, psychological evaluations, background checks, employment records. Thomas recognized some of the forms from his own experience with security clearances. I spent the next 10 years being groomed by Hartwell's people, Sterling continued. Taught to control my anger, to present a professional facade, to build a credible identity that would pass even rigorous security screening. All in preparation for eventually gaining access to the royal household. Why are you telling me this? Sterling's laugh was bitter. Because Hartwell made a mistake. He assumed that 15 years of careful conditioning would override my ability to think independently. But spending time close to Princess and seeing her genuine commitment to helping people made me realize that my anger had been misdirected. Thomas studied the man beside him, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Sterling's body language seemed genuine, his tone carrying the weight of difficult confession rather than calculated performance. What exactly was the plan? Tomorrow morning, Princess Anne is scheduled to visit a new veterans rehabilitation center in South London. Hartwell's network has spent months setting up what will appear to be a terrorist attack by foreign extremists. But the real purpose is to eliminate the princess while she's outside the normal security perimeter of the major royal residences. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. An assassination disguised as terrorism. Exactly. And, because I'm her regular driver, I would naturally be killed in the attack as well, eliminating any potential witnesses who might recognize the inside assistance the attackers received. Sterling closed the tablet and returned it to his jacket. But I'd been documenting everything, Thomas. Names, meetings, financial transfers, tactical planning. Enough evidence to expose the entire network, if it reaches the right people. Why come to me? Why not go directly to the authorities? Because Hartwell's influence extends into the security services themselves. Half the people you might trust to handle this information are either compromised or would be required to report through channels that Hartwell monitors. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. What do you need from me? I need you to be my backup plan. If something happens to me, if Hartwell realizes I've turned against the network, someone needs to know the truth. Sterling stood up from the bench and walked a few steps away, his silhouette dark against the garden's evening lighting. There's something else, Thomas. Something that will make this personal for you in ways you haven't considered. Thomas waited, though he dreaded what he was about to hear. Your replacement at the castle, Sergeant Morrison. He's been reporting your activities to Hartwell since the day you retired. Your questions about my background, your meeting with David Shen, even your suspicions about my identity, all of it has been fed back to the network. The betrayal struck Thomas harder than he had expected. Morrison was young, enthusiastic, someone Thomas had recommended for advancement. The thought that his trust had been so completely misplaced was devastating.
How long has Morrison been compromised?
Since before he joined the Guards. Hartwell's people have been placing assets throughout the royal protection system for years. Morrison was recruited during his military training, long before anyone suspected there might be a security problem.
Thomas's mind raced through the implications.
If Morrison had been reporting his activities, then David Chen's investigation was almost certainly compromised as well. Every move they had made, every precaution they had taken, would be known to Hartwell and his conspirators.
Chen's team, Thomas said.
They've been watching Sterling, you, for days.
I know.
I've been letting them think they were conducting effective surveillance while actually feeding them false information about my activities and associates. But that can't continue much longer without arousing suspicion. Sterling returned to the bench and sat down again, his voice taking on new urgency.
Tomorrow morning's operation will proceed whether I participate or not.
If I disappear or fail to show up, they'll simply eliminate me and use a backup driver. The attack will still happen, and Princess Anne will still die.
Then, we have to stop it.
We can stop this attack, but only if we're willing to sacrifice the opportunity to expose the larger network.
Once we act against tomorrow's operation, Hartwell will know his network is compromised. He'll shut everything down, eliminate evidence, and disappear into whatever backup identity he's prepared. Thomas understood the dilemma.
They could save Princess Anne's life but allow the conspiracy to survive and regroup. Or they could use tomorrow's attack as bait to expose the entire network, but at tremendous risk to the princess's safety.
There might be another way, Thomas said slowly. But it would require perfect timing and considerable risk.
Sterling leaned forward, interested.
What did you have in mind?
We let the attack proceed as planned, but we modify it slightly. Instead of Princess Anne dying, she survives but appears to be critically injured. That would satisfy the immediate objective while keeping you alive as a witness to identify the other conspirators.
How do we guarantee her survival without exposing the deception?
Thomas was quiet for a moment, working through tactical possibilities. We change the venue at the last minute, after Hartwell's people are already in position. Create confusion that forces them to improvise, which increases the chance of mistakes that expose their true identities.
And if the improvisation includes simply shooting everyone present?
Then, we make sure there are more security personnel on scene than they're expecting, people who aren't part of Hartwell's network and who are prepared for exactly that contingency. Sterling stood again, pacing a few steps in the darkness.
It could work, but the timing would have to be perfect. And we'd need people we could trust absolutely.
I might know someone, Thomas said, thinking of contacts from his years of service who had retired to private security work. People who are outside the official system but still loyal to the crown. They spent the next 20 minutes working through details, identifying potential problems and solutions. As they talked, Thomas found himself reassessing his opinion of Sterling. Whatever anger had driven the young man 15 years ago had been replaced by calculated intelligence and genuine regret for the path he had been forced to take.
One more thing, Sterling said as they prepared to leave.
After tomorrow, assuming we both survive, I'll be testifying against people who have spent years perfecting the art of eliminating inconvenient witnesses.
I'll need protection, and not from the official security services. That can be arranged.
As they parted ways, walking in different directions through the darkening gardens, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of fear and anticipation that had characterized the most dangerous moments of his career. Tomorrow would either expose one of the most serious security breaches in modern royal history, or it would end with the death of a princess he had sworn to protect. Either way, his quiet retirement was definitively over. The drive home gave Thomas time to think through his next moves. He couldn't contact Chen directly, knowing that Morrison would likely report any communication within hours. But there were other resources available, people from his past who could be trusted with sensitive operations and who operated outside the compromised official channels. Margaret was waiting up when he arrived home, though she pretended to be reading in the living room.
The book was upside down, Thomas noted with fond amusement.
"How was your evening consultation?" she asked, setting aside the book.
"Productive.
"I think I know how to help resolve the situation now."
Will it be dangerous?"
Thomas considered lying, but 30 years of marriage had taught him that Margaret could detect deception with uncanny accuracy.
"Probably.
"But it's important, Margaret."
More important than I initially realized." She nodded, accepting his answer without demanding details she knew he couldn't provide.
"Then, you'll be careful, and you'll do what needs to be done."
Just like always. That night, Thomas lay awake planning the next day's operation, considering every detail that could go wrong and how to minimize the risks to Princess Anne.
He thought about the young guard he had trusted, now revealed as a traitor. He thought about the network of conspirators who had spent years infiltrating the very system designed to protect the royal family. Most of all, he thought about the conversation he would need to have with his former colleagues, convincing them to risk their lives and reputations on the word of a retired guard and a reformed conspirator. By dawn, Thomas had his plan. It was dangerous, complex, and dependent on precise timing. But it was also the best chance they had to save Princess Anne's life while exposing the conspiracy that threatened the entire royal family. His last official duty as a royal guard was about to become the most important mission of his life. Dawn came too quickly for Thomas, though he had been awake for hours making final preparations. The plan he had developed with Sterling required split-second timing and the cooperation of people who had every reason to question his judgment. But, as he dressed in civilian clothes that might pass casual inspection, Thomas felt the familiar calm that had always descended on him before dangerous operations. The first call went to James Fletcher, a former SAS officer who now ran a discreet private security firm. Fletcher had worked royal protection details in the past and owed Thomas several favors from their shared service years. More importantly, he operated completely outside the official channels that had been compromised by Hartwell's network. "Thomas," Fletcher's gravelly voice carried the alertness of someone accustomed to early morning emergency calls.
"This is unexpected."
"I need a favor, James."
"A big one, with almost no notice and considerable risk."
There was a pause, then a chuckle.
"Must be Tuesday. What do you need?"
Thomas explained the situation in broad strokes, careful not to provide details that could compromise the operation if the call was being monitored. Fletcher listened without interruption, asking only tactical questions about timing and personnel requirements. "You're asking me to bet my company's reputation on the word of a confessed conspirator and your instincts about a security breach."
"That's exactly what I'm asking." "Right. Give me the location and timeline."
"I'll have 6 men in position within 2 hours." The second call was more difficult. Thomas had to contact Princess Anne's private secretary without going through official channels, which meant using personal relationships built over decades of service. Sarah Pemberton had been the princess's assistant for 15 years and had developed the kind of protective instincts that made her naturally suspicious of irregular communications. "Mrs. Pemberton, this is Thomas Whitmore. I apologize for the early call, but I have urgent information regarding the princess's safety."
"Sergeant Whitmore?
I thought you had retired."
"I have.
But I've become aware of a credible threat to today's scheduled visit to the Veterans Center. The princess needs to change her route and increase her security detail immediately." The conversation took 20 minutes, with Thomas providing just enough detail to convince Pemberton of the threat's legitimacy without revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. The fact that he was willing to stake his reputation on the warning carried significant weight with someone who had worked closely with him for years. "I'll speak with Her Royal Highness immediately," Pemberton said finally.
"But, Thomas, if you're wrong about this." "If I'm wrong, I'll face the consequences. But if I'm right and we do nothing, the consequences will be far worse."
By 8 in the morning, Thomas was positioned in a coffee shop across from the Veterans Center, watching as Sterling's plan began to unfold. The building was a converted warehouse in South London, chosen specifically for its location away from major royal residences and its limited escape routes that would make the attacker's job easier. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Fletcher: 6 assets in position.
Perimeter secured. Ready on your signal.
A second message came from Sarah Pemberton: HRH agrees to modified route.
Arrival delayed by 30 minutes. Additional security approved. The delay was crucial to Thomas's plan. It would force Hartwell's people to hold their positions longer than expected, increasing the chance that Fletcher's team could identify them before the attack began. It would also give Thomas time to coordinate with Sterling, who would need to play his role as unwitting driver right up until the last possible moment. At 9:15, Sterling's familiar black car appeared at the end of the street. Through the coffee shop window, Thomas watched as the vehicle approached the Veterans Center at normal speed, showing no signs that the driver suspected anything unusual about the day's schedule. But Thomas could see what Sterling couldn't: the subtle signs of hostile surveillance that his trained eye could detect even from a distance. A van parked in a position that blocked one of the main exit routes. Two men in workmen's clothes who seemed more interested in watching the street than working on the utility pole they were supposedly repairing. A woman walking her dog who had been circling the same block for 20 minutes. Thomas's phone rang. It was Sterling, calling from the car as he had been instructed. "I'm approaching the target location," Sterling said, using language that would sound routine to anyone monitoring the call. "But there seems to be some confusion about the arrival time." "The principal has been delayed," Thomas replied, sticking to the agreed-upon code. "Hold your current position and await further instructions." This was the most dangerous part of the plan. Sterling would now have to maintain his cover while surrounded by hostile elements who were becoming increasingly nervous about the changed timeline. If any of Hartwell's people suspected that their operation had been compromised, they might abandon the planned approach and simply attack Sterling directly. Through the coffee shop window, Thomas watched the black car pull to the curb about 100 yards from the Veterans Center. Sterling remained in the driver's seat, maintaining the appearance of a professional chauffeur waiting for his passenger. But Thomas knew that the man was calculating escape routes and survival odds with every passing minute. At 9:45, a new black car appeared at the opposite end of the street. This one carried Princess Anne and her official security detail, following the modified route that would bring her to the Veterans Center from an unexpected direction. The change forced Hartwell's people to reposition themselves, creating exactly the kind of confusion Thomas had been hoping for. Thomas left the coffee shop and walked casually toward a position that would give him clear sightlines to both vehicles and the Veterans Center entrance. His phone was open to Fletcher's number, ready to signal the intervention if things went wrong. Princess Anne's car approached the center and came to a stop directly in front of the main entrance, rather than at the side entrance that had been specified in the original security plan. Thomas saw one of the fake workmen speaking urgently into a concealed radio, clearly trying to adapt to the unexpected change. Sterling's car began moving again, approaching Princess Anne's vehicle as if to take up a backup position. But Thomas noticed that Sterling was driving slightly faster than necessary, positioning his car to partially block the line of sight between the fake workman and the princess's location. The attack, when it came, was both sudden and confused. The woman with the dog dropped her leash and reached for something in her jacket. The fake workmen abandoned their utility pole and began moving toward Princess Anne's car. The van that had been blocking an exit route started its engine and began to accelerate. Thomas pressed Fletcher's number and said simply, "Now." What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Fletcher's men appeared from concealed positions around the Veterans Center, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The woman reaching for her weapon found herself facing two armed men before she could draw. The fake workmen were tackled to the ground before they had covered half the distance to Princess Anne's car. The van driver attempted to ram Princess Anne's vehicle but found his path blocked by Sterling's car, which had positioned itself perfectly to absorb the impact while protecting the princess. The crash was significant but not fatal, though it left Sterling slumped unconscious over his steering wheel. Thomas ran toward the scene, his years of training overriding the physical limitations of age and civilian status. Princess Anne's security detail had formed a protective circle around their principal, but Thomas could see that the princess was unharmed and maintaining her characteristic composure under pressure. "Secure the area," Thomas called to Fletcher's men, though they were already completing that task with professional efficiency. "We need all of these people alive for questioning." As police sirens began to wail in the distance, Thomas knelt beside Sterling's car to check on the man who had risked everything to prevent the assassination.
Sterling was conscious but groggy, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the steering wheel during the collision.
"Did it work?" Sterling asked weakly. Thomas looked around at the scene, Princess in safe, the attackers in custody, Fletcher's men securing evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy.
"Yes," he said. "It worked." The next several hours were a blur of police interviews, intelligence debriefings, and media management as the authorities worked to contain the story while investigating the full scope of the conspiracy.
Thomas found himself in the unusual position of being both a key witness and an unofficial advisor to the investigation. The evidence Sterling had collected proved to be devastating to Hartwell's network. Financial records, communication intercepts, and detailed operational plans painted a picture of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. By evening, arrests were being made across London as the security services moved to roll up the entire organization. Richard Hartwell himself was taken into custody at his home office residence, along with computers and documents that would provide evidence for dozens of additional prosecutions. The investigation revealed that the network had successfully placed assets in positions throughout the Royal Protection System, the police, and even the intelligence services themselves. Sergeant Morrison was arrested at Windsor Castle, his decades of loyal service revealed to be an elaborate deception. The betrayal stung Thomas personally, but he found himself more saddened than angry about the young man's choices. Sterling recovered from his injuries and, as promised, provided detailed testimony about the conspiracy's operations and personnel. In recognition of his crucial role in preventing the assassination, he was offered protection and a new identity, though Thomas suspected the man would choose to disappear rather than trust his safety to official channels. Princess N, for her part, insisted on continuing with her scheduled visit to the Veterans Center once the scene was secure. In her view, allowing the conspiracy to disrupt her work would represent a victory for the forces that sought to undermine the monarchy. Late that evening, Thomas found himself back at Windsor Castle, standing in the courtyard where he had spent 28 years of his life. David Chen had asked him to provide a final briefing to the security team, sharing insights that might prevent similar penetrations in the future. "How did you know?" Chen asked as they walked through the familiar corridors. "What made you suspect that there was more to this than just one disturbed individual?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Experience, mostly. But also intuition. When someone spends that many years learning to recognize threats, you develop a sense for when something doesn't fit the expected patterns. The official report will reflect that your actions prevented a successful assassination and exposed a conspiracy that threatened the entire royal family. There will be recognition, Thomas. Probably a knighthood." Thomas shook his head. "I'm retired, David. I did what needed to be done, but I don't need public recognition for it." As he prepared to leave the castle for what he assumed would truly be the final time, Thomas encountered Sarah Pemberton in the main corridor. The princess's private secretary looked exhausted but relieved. "Her Royal Highness wanted me to convey her personal thanks," Pemberton said. "She asked me to tell you that she won't forget what you did today." "Just doing my job," Thomas replied. "No," Pemberton said firmly. "You were retired. You could have ignored your suspicions, enjoyed your garden, and left the worrying to active personnel. Instead, you risked your life and reputation to protect someone you had sworn to serve. That's not just doing a job, Thomas. That's loyalty of the highest order." The drive home took Thomas through London streets that seemed different somehow, as if the day's events had changed his perspective on the familiar city. He found himself thinking about the nature of duty, about how some obligations transcended official employment and formal recognition. Margaret was waiting in their garden when he arrived, tending to her roses in the fading evening light. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of relief and pride. "It's finished?" she asked. "It's finished. Princess Anne is safe, and the people responsible have been arrested." "And Thomas Whitmore can finally retire properly?" Thomas looked around at their small garden, at the cottage they had bought for their golden years, at the woman who had supported him through nearly 3 decades of dangerous and demanding work. "Yes," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Thomas Whitmore can finally retire."
But, as he watched Margaret work among her roses, Thomas reflected that some forms of service never really ended. The skills, the instincts, the willingness to act when others were in danger, these things became part of who you were, not just what you did for a living. If the crown ever needed him again, he would be ready. But, for now, he was content to tend gardens, spend time with grandchildren, and enjoy the quiet satisfaction of duty well performed. The threats to the royal family would continue, as they always had. But, they would be met by new generations of guards and protectors, trained in the same traditions of loyalty and service that had guided Thomas throughout his career. His final shift was truly over. But, his commitment to protecting those he had served would endure as long as he drew breath. In the gathering darkness of his first evening of genuine retirement, Thomas Whitmore smiled and reached for Margaret's hand, finally, at peace with the knowledge that he had given everything he had to give in service of the crown he loved.